explaining the square cube law. There's a structure and it's a certain size. If I make it twice the size, it gets twice as long and twice as deep. So think of it as the sides of a square. You've got the side of a square and the side of a square. So that's the square. So it's got stronger by the square. Now, doesn't mean it's a square structure, it's just a mathematical term. However, I've only got 4 of these, but if you can see that if I put another 4 of these on top, I have 8 of them. So it's got 4 times as strong and 8 times as heavy. So as you can see, the weight has doubled with respect to its strength. Now, there's a structure. Now if I make it 3 times as big, the Rubik's Cube is roughly 3 times as big as the little cube. It's 3 times as wide, 3 times as long. That means it's 9 times as strong because it's got 9 times the supporting area. However, it's got 9, 18, 27. It's 9 times as strong and 27 times as heavy. Put that back in the robot. That's a Rubik's Cube solving robot my son and I made for some fun, and yes, it does actually work. However, because things feel more stress as they get bigger, by the time they reach that size, the stresses are huge. And compared to those very large stresses, steel starts to become flexible, which is why it needs to be carefully braced and steadied and held. For instance, if I have a post, here's a post. Now, you don't want the post to wobble, so you can connect the post to a frame, and that frame is surprisingly rigid. It's really surprisingly rigid. It's just crisscross, and it holds everything rigid, which is what those frames on the end there are for. And it's simply because when you go very big, big frames tend to be inherently wobbly, which is why they need careful designing and bracing. And incidentally, this stuff, that's designed to replicate the feel of steel plate on the small scale. So with this behaves on the small scale in the same way that steel plate behaves on the big scale. Now it's specially designed to do that. And this represents a flexible plate, a steel plate that's actually quite flexible. And yeah, look at this. That's just 4 of those flat sheets of plastic joined in a circle. In a square. So that's square. Now, this amazing thing. See how strong that is? I can put my weight on that. And that weight represents several thousand tons of old boiler. And yet, all it is, flexible plastic. What makes it rigid is the fact that it's joined together at the corners. Joining plates together at the corners makes them incredibly strong. Sydney Harbour Bridge is the same thing. Many of these columns actually were basically stacked on top of each other and then just had bolts going through, and that effectively the building had columns that just stood one on top of each other like that to make big long columns. And even though that's a separatable joint, it took my weight no bother. Now, building was 3 columns a side. This has been made very narrow in width to facilitate filmmaking, but 3 columns either side, big top frame, girders going across the top frame. There's a more scale model of it, and everything hung from the underside of that huge top frame. Now, on the side of each top frame were 2 enormous beams. There's the beam there, sitting across the columns. if you have a beam if you have a plank that's flat, like a scaffolding plank, it can be strong, but it's also quite flexible. However, if you stand it on its edge like that, if you stand it on its edge, surprising how strong and rigid it is. Yeah, that is not wanting to bend at all. In fact, if I push really hard, it doesn't actually bend. What it does, it starts to twist. So I don't know if you can see that. Very narrow beams will tend to twist on load. But of course, these beams were braced by the thing that they supported, so that wasn't a problem. So let's have a look at the building. The building. And suddenly our computer's deciding not to select. There it is. There's the 3 columns. That one has been very neatly cut around the top there. That is it's been gone around with a gas axe all the way around, right the way around the column. So they've been completely separated. There would have been a top bit sticking up to about there, and then the beam running across it. You can actually see the Unit 3 beam on the vaguely in the background. Probably doesn't show on camera. So what you're crudely looking at is basically that. Now, that's been gone around completely, and it's been cut at an angle to facilitate it sliding off. And there's a good reason for that, because steel frames are so resilient that when you blast a steel building, let me go round, you set your cutting charges, there's an almighty bang, the whole building goes over. I've actually seen this happen on YouTube. Goes over, and it's like that. So your whole building has gone over, and the damn thing's still in one piece. The building has just toppled a bit. And that is the very worst situation. Oh, timber. That's the very worst situation for a demolition company to be in, where a building has sort of done that, and it's still basically intact, and there's twisted steel. And how do you deal with something like that? You know, it's a demolition company's worst nightmare. The structure hasn't actually broken up. So to make absolutely damn sure it does break up, there are standard techniques employed throughout the whole demolition industry, and one of those techniques, let's put this back up, because you saw what happened there. It toppled over, and then a few seconds later it started to collapse some more. Well, if that had been a real structure and real workmen had gone in after the initial demolition, the further movement it could have been absolutely deadly. So that's why demolition companies really want to make sure that a whole structure separates completely and properly from the word go. Let me just put the leg back on. Now, incidentally, the structure, those top beams were so rigid because of how they don't remember the ruler, that if I lift the middle leg of the structure slightly off the ground, you see the weight has come completely off the front leg. You see it moving freely? Well, that's significant. You see, what I've done is I've chopped this leg up very slightly. Table.